Okay, we are going to look this time at some of the challenges for your design system. So if you followed the previous one, we've defined what it is we want, we've got our brand documents, we've set up our design system or our component library, we've kind of got a basis going of what we're working on. Where are you going to run into problems most likely? I mean, basically, the long and short of it is the components creak under the hard weight of reality. There's a problem with moving that static design into reality, into some live environment. You'll suddenly run fresh into issues which hadn't been defined by those components because they're always designed in a kind of ideal use case. So straight away, obviously moving from a static file to a web page, suddenly your dimensions are going to be more varied. So now have we thought of how this thing will look in a mobile display, but also somewhere between mobile and desktop? What about super wide displays? Does this component just stretch and stretch? Does it have a max width? How can we make content still display neatly and not kind of messy? Do we have some sort of fallbacks? And then the opposite, when it's too small, what about when text overflows? Do we wrap this? Do we allow multiple lines? Do we deal with this in some way that doesn't just stretch the component or push the spacing down? How does this component play with other components? Now that this one's got certain rules on it and other ones, are they going to sort of push and fight with each other? Do we need some sort of layout settings about how they should display in different contexts? What about content that's not there? Yes, this always looks nice with a heading, but what about if this dynamic data means the user's not going to have a heading every time? Do we have a fallback? Do we just show an icon or an image? Do we have something useful? We might find actually there are entire pages now that look empty and sparse because of we don't have the data we ideally would have to display this. Are we going to have some sort of stage to working towards the ideal one where, like, in the meantime while we're gathering all that data, we're going to need some variation on the component to display something else? What about images that don't load properly? Do we have a fallback that displays neatly? And again, if most of the pages are going to have this, it's a case of the component's lovely, but in reality it's never going to look like that because we're not going to have sufficient data. We need to think of a design that's going to suit this better. So it's rather than it being a one-way convention of we design the thing, we build it, and then we roll it out into the live website, there's more of a conversation about the actual practicalities of implementing something and the new complexities that might throw up. Sometimes, and it's often to do with a time concern, is that you run into a problem on that component in the use case you're doing. So this feature we want to add requires there's a kind of a disabled state on this component. We haven't actually got a disabled design for this component or a disabled setting. So what I'll do is I'll use some overwrite styles. I'll just use some CSS settings to kind of force a display setting onto this component in this particular context. That is a dark path to be going down because you're now starting to use in situ edge case specific settings on a component because it wasn't open and adaptable enough. Obviously, with more time, you say, this should be a change to the component. We're going to go back to the component library, say we need a change to allow it to have a disabled state to save this use case. Then design might need to adapt this in some way. You might then need to update the styles and the settings for this component to make it compatible with every other environment where it's used, so it's kind of an option maybe. Then you need to update that component, bring it over, and then you need to update the actual use case you were looking for. This might be a round dialogue that's tricky, so it's about kind of making sure that process is smooth and streamlined and easy to work within a development environment so that you can easily make changes as needed and keep your components up to date. Generally, the thing you have to avoid is that update in situ because it's only going to go quite bad over time. Because, I don't know if it needs clarifying, but like, obviously later on, if somebody has actually introduced that disabled setting, but there's already a bunch of overwrites in several places throughout the application, you've just got so much more cleaning up to do to make everything consistent again. You're defeating the entire object of having a component library. So what we're getting into there is about splitting out versus configuring. So, I don't know, you have let's stick with a drop-down component, and instead of having slim rows of text You want to have a quite quirky variation where it's going to, each drop down option is going to be a picture. At that point you go, is that an adaptation of our drop down? It's going to be a slight adapted version, so this is going to be a picture drop down, or is that a new component entirely? And really you're getting into the same conversation about refactoring, about which point do you refactor something and move it out? What point do you make something reusable versus making it a configurable value? And there's not a correct answer. You're trying to predict the future, really, because let's say you go down the path of saying we're going to make this an adaptation, so it's just going to have different style rules. You have a setting at the top to go, this is an image type, and it changes the style slightly. It allows better display. You pick an image and it's going to show a preview of the image or something. It's going to work slightly differently. Well, that can become a problem because of more and more things might be built into this image drop down, and suddenly over time you realize you're basically just working on an image drop down. And it does, if you change loads of configuration settings, you can still get the regular text drop down, but that's rarely used. And actually a lot of the settings now are overhead. When you use a text drop down, you're going to have to add loads of falses and negative checks to sort of make it just wrangle in that traditional way, because you've made it so configurable. It's just basically two separate things. You should have made it two components because they're so different. You're having to add loads of options to kind of differentiate them. But maybe you didn't know that. You just picked wrong. Or you go down the other path. You say early on, like, yeah, we should make this two different components. The use cases for them are going to be two different. We're going to need two variations. So you make a copy of your dropdown and you start making all your changes over here for a new type of image dropdown. And that way your original one stays clean. Well, okay, but you might then find changes that affect them both. So now we want a button that's going to clear the current selection. Well, we're going to have to add it to the text one and to the image one. Now we want the option to show a loading spinner when you're loading the results. So you're going to have to add that to the text one and to the image one. Every subsequent change is going to have to happen in two places. You probably shouldn't have split them out because of everything's making problems. Or you had, I don't know, you had a base one and then you made two variations off of it. You solved it in some way like that. Either way, it's just there's no easy way of doing that. You just have to try and make judgments of how likely is this component going to be reused. Is this a particular quirk, a particular thing we can make a small setting for, or is this really making a case for being a full new component separately? You're just constantly going to have to ride that line in between splitting out into separate components or just making configurable rules, and there's no easy way of answering that. And that kind of leads into the other issue of, maybe you're not going to need it. Sometimes a small setting can lead you to think we should make a component all the time. Once you've got that mindset, you're constantly looking for new rules and new components. And again, are you actually going to need that in future? Let's try and think of a good use case. So let's say you have a banner component which always has a button in the bottom right corner. And this month there's a new feature and the image you're using on the banner has got like a blue background, and because the button's always blue, they just kind of clash. It doesn't look very good. So your over-eager product person comes in and says that button should now be like an orange. You think, orange? We don't reuse orange anywhere in our system. We don't have orange buttons. That just doesn't work. That doesn't make sense. But, they're super eager to have this change, so they kind of go past the rules that you usually work within. You have to make a decision there, like, okay, is this a rule now? Should we make a rule that when the image clashes, we can have an alternate? So there could be an alternate color. Now we go into the design system, we make an alternate. Maybe, but maybe this image is going to be used for 2 weeks, and then they change it, and then it never changes like back in that way again. So you made a whole rule for one particular use case, which never came up again. So you just made a setting for something which no one's ever going to need, it's never going to be used, and really it shouldn't have been done in the first place. So you've gone too far. You're just constantly making new rules or building new components for single uses or building little adjustments and variations for things which aren't necessarily needed. Maybe you need a little bit of leeway in your system, or actually in the live environment you do allow a little bit of customization here and there to allow some alternates and variations without constantly making that new defined rules and new systems, because of you're adding overhead that's kind of unnecessary. But again, that's a very debatable point. So you might then be dealing with styling clashes. I mean, really the most sensible thing with your components is you really scope those styles in. You really make some sort of library that's going to make unique class names for each one, and you try not to just use generic classes that could easily be overwritten. And that boils down to everything from settings for just images or H1 tags in general, which are now going to add inadvertent changes to your components. But also, if your component is just going to use a class like button dash small, you're allowing anyone in the actual context, in the environment or application you're using it, to now just use those classes directly. I can just jump onto these things intentionally or not. I can overwrite styles. And again, going back to that first point about your changing things in particular contexts or particular usages, you're going down a dark path where those components are not going to remain pure and reusable. They're going to be kind of a few loose settings that are going to easily be kind of pulled in different directions depending on the context. So trying to scope those styles as much as possible. This is a clean thing, and if you need to make any style overwrites, those have to be settings that go directly into the component. You really want to avoid anyone being able to kind of overwrite from above, because it's going to get quite messy. And it's a further point beyond styles, I guess, in any of the props. If you want to make sure that you allow the thing to be configurable enough, you want people to be able to edit things and change things. I want to be able to pass a custom class name in. I want to be able to pass a custom setting. I want to be able to add a callback or something. But maybe don't just pass everything straight through to the element, because at the same time you're going to lose its value, its actual shape, because you're going to allow the thing to be so configurable that it's going to lose its value as an actual component. It needs to deliver, a particular feature with a few variations. And again, it's just that line of how customizable do you make it, and does it need to now be a separate component because it's become over customizable? So we're kind of going back to the same themes over and over, but really the thing you're coming back to is, are you making life easy for yourself? Like, is this easier for your developers to work with now that you can consult some rules? Now you can go look at these components in a particular clean environment and see what they do, see what their configuration options are. Are you able to just keep reusing those components over and over with predictable results and make your development process quicker? Are you delivering consistent designs? If all these things are yes, then this design system is working, and it doesn't matter whether you followed the correct documentation, whether you did it in perhaps the preferred industry standard way. If you've built something which is making life easier and is making it easier for you to deliver on what your aims are, then it's a success. These things you're going to run into, though, about how customizable those components are, but how they also work in lots of fallback situations, those are probably going to be the biggest challenges you face, and having the right strategy and navigating those are going to kind of determine how successful your system is. If you're finding you spend all your time customizing your components and configuring them and rebuilding them, it might have been easier to not bother and just have done the whole thing in one big messy pile. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know if you disagree. It's a very interesting topic, really, about how to best build these things. Maybe no one's solved it. Anyway, let's roll forward. We'll have one more video on this. We'll look at whose maintenance of this system is most important. But that's all. Go and have a lovely day.